Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you thought was pain was actually something else, something deeper, something older than memory, something you've been carrying not just for years, but for your entire life, and maybe even before that. You've been taught to believe that suffering is just bad luck, misfortune, or the result of external events. But what if it isn't? What if suffering is a code? A message? A mirror reflecting the parts of you you've never dared to look at? This is not going to be a comfortable video. But if you stay, if you truly listen, you may never see your pain the same way again.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
This is the truth Freud discovered, and it terrified people. Because it meant everything we think we know about pain, trauma, anxiety, even depression was incomplete. Freud wasn't trying to make us feel better. He was trying to make us honest. And in that honesty, he found something most people spend their whole lives running from. Our suffering is not meaningless. It's revealing something. Our suffering is not random. It's structured. It's intelligent. It comes from within. And if we can decode it, we can transform it. Freud believed that suffering is the shadow of desire. That behind every pain is a longing we've buried so deep, we don't even know it's there anymore. You suffer not just because something happened, but because something inside you was never allowed to speak. You were told to repress it, to ignore it, to adapt. And so you pushed it below the surface of your consciousness. But it didn't die. It became the ghost haunting your dreams, your relationships, your thoughts when no one else is around. Let's go deeper. Why do we suffer in patterns? Why do we keep choosing the wrong people, sabotaging the right opportunities, fearing things that haven't happened? Freud would say, it's because your unconscious is playing out a story you never finished, a memory you never healed, a need that was never met. And until you bring that inner world into the light, you will keep reliving it over and over, in different faces and in different places, but always the same emotional blueprint. Have you ever cried and had no idea why? Have you ever felt an emptiness so deep it scared you? That is not weakness. That is not failure. That is your unconscious trying to speak. And Freud's genius was this. He gave us a way to listen, a way to trace the pain, not just to events, but to meanings, to the symbols, dreams, and unspoken truths that shape us more than we realize. He called it the return of the repressed. Everything you suppress doesn't disappear. It comes back louder. It returns disguised as anxiety, addiction, self-hate, perfectionism, rage. Suffering, in this view, is the return of the truth you tried to bury. And that's why you can't just think positive or move on. Because until you face what's underneath, your mind will find 1,000 ways to remind you what you refuse to feel. So what are you refusing to feel? What part of your past have you locked away so tightly that you forgot the key even existed? And what would happen if your suffering is not your enemy, but your deepest teacher? Would you still run from it, or would you begin to lean in? Freud said the goal of therapy was not to make people happy, but to transform neurotic suffering into ordinary unhappiness. That sounds depressing until you understand what he meant. Neurotic suffering is the suffering we create because we refuse to face reality. It's the tangled mess of lies, fears, and defenses we build to protect ourselves from pain, and in doing so, we create more pain. Ordinary unhappiness is different. It's the pain of living in truth, of facing life as it is, not as we wish it to be. And in that truth, there's freedom. Here's the twist. Most of us are more afraid of truth than pain. We would rather suffer in familiar ways than confront the unfamiliar reality of who we really are. We identify with our wounds. I am anxious. I am depressed. I am broken. But what if those are not identities, but symptoms? What if they're pointing to something? Something buried, something sacred, something waiting to be seen. Have you ever had a dream that disturbed you? That made no sense but lingered all day? Freud believed dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. That in dreams, our hidden desires and fears speak in code. You dream of falling not because you're afraid of heights, but because you're afraid of letting go. You dream of being chased not because someone is after you, but because you're running from a part of yourself. Dreams are messages disguised in metaphor. And if you can learn to read them, you can begin to understand what your mind has been trying to tell you all along. That's the hidden psychology of suffering. It's not just what you feel, it's what your feeling is trying to reveal. And the problem is, we've been trained to silence those messages. When a child cries, we distract them. When we feel sad, we numb it. When we're afraid, we fake confidence. But every time we do, we miss a chance to listen, to learn, to heal. Freud gave us a terrifying but liberating idea that even our worst behaviors have meaning. That the addict, the narcissist, the self-saboteur is not evil, but wounded, acting from a script they didn't write, but one they can rewrite. And the rewriting begins with awareness. So here's a question to hold in your mind right now. What pain in your life has become a habit? What suffering have you normalized so much that you no longer question it? And what if it's not necessary? What if it's a signal that you've misunderstood? Freud introduced the concept of defense mechanisms, ways we protect ourselves from what we don't want to feel. Denial, projection, repression, displacement. We lie to ourselves not because we're dishonest, but because we're scared. We push others away not because we hate them, but because we fear abandonment. We get angry not because we're strong, but because we feel powerless. And until we decode these defenses, we will keep suffering without knowing why. This is the journey Freud invites us on, not to escape suffering, but to understand it, to sit with it, to trace it back to its root. And in doing so, to reclaim the parts of ourselves we lost along the way. Imagine going into the deepest part of your mind, a place no one else can see, a place even you forgot existed. And there, you find a younger version of you, alone, confused, carrying pain they never deserved. What would you say to them? Would you ignore them, the way you've ignored your own suffering? Or would you finally listen? Because that's the path to healing, not fixing, not improving, but listening, understanding, integrating. Freud didn't promise happiness. He promised awareness. And from awareness, everything changes. Now let's take this even further. What if suffering is not just personal but collective? What if we, as a society, are repressing something? A truth about our humanity, our past, our nature. And what if the anxiety, depression, and chaos we see in the world is not just a breakdown but a breakthrough trying to happen? Freud's work implies that healing is not about becoming better, it's about becoming whole. And to become whole, you must invite your shadow to the table. The parts of you you've disowned, the rage, the lust, the fear, the grief. Because those parts are not your enemy. They are your power, waiting to be reclaimed. We suffer most when we refuse to be who we are, when we try to be what others expect, when we wear masks to survive and then forget we're wearing them. But your suffering remembers. It calls you, not to punish you, but to awaken you. What if suffering isn't a problem to be solved, but a doorway to be entered? We've been conditioned to see pain as something we must eliminate, conquer, or silence. But Freud saw it differently. He saw suffering as a signal, a language, a psychic phenomenon that reveals what words often cannot. And if we take that idea seriously, we begin to reinterpret our entire history, not just as a collection of events, but as a map of unprocessed emotion, unmet needs, and unresolved desires. When we suffer, it's not random. It's precise. It's the exact place where the unconscious is trying to break through the surface of our carefully constructed egos. And that ego, this image of ourselves that we present to the world, is one of the most fragile, yet defended structures of the mind. Freud believed the ego is constantly mediating between the inner world of our primitive desires, the ID, the outer world of rules and expectations, the superego, and the reality in between. The ego is like a diplomat trying to keep peace between a wild animal, a strict judge, and the chaos of life. And when it fails, when the pressure becomes too much, suffering emerges. Anxiety, neuroses, depression, compulsions, these are not signs that we are broken. They are signs that our inner world is at war. Have you ever felt like part of you wants something so badly, but another part punishes you for it? That's the Freudian conflict. The ID says, I want this now. The superego says, you should be ashamed for even thinking that. And the ego? It gets torn apart in the middle. This is where suffering lies, not in the desire itself, but in the war over whether or not you're allowed to have it. Freud didn't believe we suffer because we are bad. He believed we suffer because we are divided. And healing is not about getting rid of that division, it's about understanding it. Think about your own life. What do you desire that you feel guilty about? What do you long for that you've convinced yourself is wrong, or foolish, or impossible? And who taught you that? Was it your parents? Your religion? Your society? Or was it the internalized voice of a culture that fears authenticity because it cannot control it? Freud introduced the idea of the superego as that internal judge, the voice inside our minds that criticizes, shames, and punishes. It sounds like you, but it's not you. It's the voice of the past, the voice of your caretakers, your teachers, your culture. And unless you become aware of it, you will mistake it for your own conscience. But conscience and conditioning are not the same. One is your soul speaking. The other is your programming. So here's the question. How much of your suffering is caused not by what you feel, but by how you judge what you feel? How much pain is actually shame dressed up as morality? Freud would want you to see that the enemy is not desire. The enemy is repression, the act of pushing down what is natural because it doesn't fit the image you were told to maintain. And repression, like a pressure cooker, always builds until it finds another way out. Look at society. We repress our rage, and it turns into violence. We repress our sexuality, and it turns into obsession or dysfunction. We repress our grief, and it turns into depression. What we don't express, we act out. What we don't integrate, we project. And so the unconscious becomes our reality, not because it's destiny, but because we refuse to face it directly. In Freud's method, psychoanalysis was never about giving advice or solutions. It was about creating space for truth to emerge. Through free association, dreams, slips of the tongue, and patterns in behavior, he helped people uncover the hidden roots of their suffering. And what emerged was often shocking, not because it was evil, but because it was honest. People discovered their rage toward their parents, their envy toward siblings, their taboo desires, in their unbearable guilt. But in that exposure, healing could begin. Because when you bring the unconscious into consciousness, you reclaim your power. It's easy to think of healing as becoming better. But Freud challenges us to think of healing as becoming more conscious, more aware, more integrated. You don't need to become someone else. You need to become who you are without shame. And that means facing the parts of yourself you were taught to hide. Have you ever wondered why some wounds never seem to go away? Why some emotional pain feels timeless, as if it's not just yours but something inherited? Freud's work opens the door to transgenerational suffering. The idea that pain can pass down through silence, secrecy, and unresolved trauma. Your suffering might not even begin with you. It might be the echo of a story your family never told, a grief that was never spoken, a loss that was never mourned. And now it lives in your body, your mind, your relationships, begging to be seen. So what do we do with this? How do we move forward if suffering is rooted so deeply, so invisibly? The first step is to stop resisting it, to stop trying to fix it, medicate it, distract from it. Instead, we must become curious. Why does this pain exist? What is it trying to protect me from? What truth is it pointing to? And what would happen if I stopped fighting it and started listening? Freud believed that insight, deep, honest insight, is the beginning of transformation. Not insight as information, but insight as confrontation. The moment you see something in yourself that you cannot unsee, or a pattern, a lie, a need, and in that moment you have a choice: continue as before, or begin the slow, courageous process of change. But change is not safe. It's not comfortable. Because it means letting go of the identity built around your suffering, the role of the victim, the martyr, the people pleaser, the overachiever. These are not just behaviors. They're strategies, coping mechanisms to deal with inner conflict. And when you no longer need them, you may feel lost. That's the paradox of growth. You must lose who you thought you were to become who you truly are. Ask yourself now, what part of your identity is built on suffering? What would be left if you stopped needing to prove, to please, to perform? Would you be free, or would you be terrified? Freud would say that freedom begins when we stop lying to ourselves. When we stop blaming the world and start looking within, not with judgment, but with radical honesty. With compassion for the child inside, who learned to survive in a world that didn't always make space for truth. That child is still in you, still waiting, still hurting. And the only way to meet them is to stop pretending you have it all together. This is the hidden psychology of suffering. It's not a flaw. It's a message. Your pain is not against you. It's for you. It's the part of your psyche that refuses to accept a false life, that keeps calling you back to what's real. And the more you ignore it, the louder it becomes. Until one day, it breaks through in a breakdown, a crisis, a collapse. But even then, it's not the end. It's the beginning. Because in breakdowns, we find the cracks in the mask. In crisis, we find the truth beneath the illusion. And in suffering, we find the path home. Freud's legacy is not just about theory. It's about courage. The courage to look within, to feel what you've denied, and to listen to what you've silenced, and to live not as a product of repression, but as an expression of truth. There comes a moment in every inner journey where suffering begins to change shape. It no longer appears as just pain or misfortune. It transforms into a voice, a signal, a guide that won't be silenced. Freud believed suffering was not senseless, but structured, and that it pointed somewhere specific if we had the courage to follow it. Most people spend their lives trying to silence their pain, but what if that pain isn't trying to destroy us? What if it's trying to show us the exact place where we're still living a lie? Freud's work centered on the idea that suffering is the surface expression of unconscious conflicts. These are not random wounds, but unresolved tensions between our desires, our fears, and the roles we've been forced to play. When those tensions boil over, they manifest in our lives as symptoms: anxiety, depression, compulsive behaviors, or a lingering emptiness we can't explain. Freud invites us to go beneath the symptom, to trace it back to its psychological root. He believed that if we could understand the source, we could begin to dissolve the symptom not by force, but by insight. Consider the concept of repetition compulsion, one of Freud's most haunting ideas. It suggests that we unconsciously recreate painful scenarios from our past, again and again, as if trying to rewrite the ending. We choose similar partners, fall into the same arguments, or sabotage ourselves at the brink of success. This isn't because we enjoy suffering, but because our mind is trying to resolve a wound that never fully healed. And until we become conscious of the pattern, we remain trapped in it like actors in a script we never wrote. Ask yourself, what emotional patterns have followed you your entire life? Do you always feel abandoned, even when people stay? Do you push people away before they can hurt you? These aren't just quirks of personality, they are the echoes of unresolved pain. Freud teaches us that our psyche is not just a container of memories, but a living system that's constantly trying to resolve its inner conflicts. And suffering is the price we pay until we learn how to listen to it. Freud also explored the idea of the superego, the inner critic that judges, punishes, and shames us. This voice, though it sounds like our own, is often a reflection of early authority figures and societal expectations. It tells us we're not good enough, that we should do more, be more, feel less. And when we try to rebel against it, we feel guilt or anxiety, even when we're doing what's right for us. This is another source of hidden suffering, the internal war between who we are and who we think we're supposed to be. This internal war can be exhausting because it keeps us from ever feeling whole. We split ourselves into parts: the acceptable and the unacceptable, the light and the shadow. Freud believed that true healing comes not from choosing one over the other, but from integration. You are not just your achievements or your smiles. You are also your anger, your desire, your grief, and none of it makes you unworthy. Our culture often teaches us to suppress our darker emotions, but Freud urged us to explore them. He didn't mean we should act on every impulse, but that we should understand where they come from. When we don't, they don't disappear, they become symptoms. A person who represses anger may become passive-aggressive or chronically anxious. A person who represses desire may become emotionally numb or obsessed with control. One of Freud's most powerful tools for uncovering hidden suffering was the dream. He called dreams the royal road to the unconscious because they bypass the ego's defenses and reveal deeper truths. Your dream about drowning might not be about water, it might be about overwhelm. A dream about being chased might reveal a truth you're running from. The symbols in dreams are not random, they are coded expressions of the unconscious mind trying to be heard. So ask yourself, when was the last time you truly listened to your dreams, your body, your instincts? Most of us are trained to quiet these signals, to override them with logic or productivity. But the cost of that is disconnection from our truth, from our needs, from our inner world. Freud's message was not to live in the unconscious, but to bring it into consciousness. Because once you see what's been hidden, you have a chance to choose differently. Awareness is not always comfortable. In fact, it often hurts more at first. When you uncover a truth you've been avoiding, it can feel like your world is collapsing. But that collapse is a necessary part of transformation. You cannot build a new self on top of a false life without first tearing something down. This is where courage becomes essential. Not the kind of courage that makes you look strong to others, but the kind that allows you to sit with yourself when you feel weak. The kind that lets you say, I don't have all the answers, but I'm willing to see the truth. Freud believed that insight, real, sustained, emotional insight, had the power to free us from compulsive suffering. Not because it removes the pain, but because it removes the confusion around it. And when that confusion lifts, something else appears: choice. You begin to realize that you are not just a victim of your past. You are also the interpreter of it. You get to decide what it means, what you carry forward, and what you leave behind. Freud didn't give us a cure for suffering. He gave us a compass, a way to navigate through the internal labyrinth of pain, memory, and unmet needs. But even Freud knew the journey wasn't only individual. Our suffering is also collective. The unspoken traumas of families, the repressed guilt of nations, the anxieties of generations, they all live in us. You may be carrying pain that didn't even start with you. Freud opened the door to this understanding, showing us that the psyche is not isolated, it's deeply embedded in the social and historical fabric. So healing is not just personal, it's radical. When you face your suffering, you don't just heal yourself. You break a cycle. You refuse to pass the wound forward. You become the one who stops pretending and starts feeling, who stops hiding and starts speaking. And in that act, you create space for others to do the same. Now we arrive at the final theme, death. Freud believed that much of our suffering, is tied to our fear of our own mortality. We live in denial of the fact that everything we love will one day end, and that denial fuels anxiety, control, and compulsive striving. But what if we faced that fear directly? What if we accepted that life is short, unpredictable, and precious? In doing so, we would suffer less from illusion and more from truth. And the suffering born from truth is a noble suffering. It teaches us to live more urgently, to love more fiercely, to let go of what doesn't matter. It teaches us that being human is not about perfection, it's about presence. And presence begins when we stop trying to escape ourselves. So now, ask yourself the final question. What part of your suffering have you been avoiding? And what would happen if you turned toward it instead? What would you learn? Who would you become? What illusions would fall away? And what truths would rise in their place? The hidden psychology of suffering is not a theory, it's a doorway. It's the path into the parts of yourself you've been taught to fear. But behind that fear is not darkness. It's depth. It's complexity. It's the raw material of your transformation. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to fix everything overnight. You only need to be willing to listen, willing to feel, willing to know yourself more deeply than ever before. Because in the end, your suffering is not your enemy. It is your invitation. And if you accept it, you may discover the most powerful truth of all, that the healing you've been searching for has been inside you the entire time.